It was one of the quietest entrances the Vatican had seen in modern history. No grand processional. No ornate declaration. No triumphal address from the balcony. Instead, Pope Leo XIV stepped into his role the way he had lived his life, softly, with his head slightly bowed and his heart deeply open. He arrived not as a sovereign, but as a servant. His first request? That his inaugural Mass be celebrated in the small chapel of Casa Santa Marta, the very place where Pope Francis once lived, rather than the grand stage of St. Peter's Basilica. He declined the golden throne prepared for him. He chose instead a simple wooden chair worn at the edges. Observers were confused. Some were disappointed. But those who watched closely, those who listened, knew something extraordinary had begun. "I am not here to rule the Church," he said. "I am here to walk beside her." With the Vatican at his feet, Leo XIV chose to kneel. And that single gesture rewrote the tone of a papacy. Every morning, before the bells of St. Peter's Basilica echoed through the ancient corridors of the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV was already awake. Not to review documents or greet dignitaries, but to walk alone through the gardens, barefoot on occasion, as if to feel the breath of the earth beneath him. He began each day not as the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics, but as a man in need of grace. Unlike many of his predecessors, Pope Leo XIV chose not to surround himself with layers of papal staff. His inner circle was small: a cook, a gardener, and an elderly nun who had once served the poor alongside him in Peru. He rose early, prayed silently in a modest chapel, and ate frugally, a bowl of lentils, bread, and tea. When asked why he kept such a simple rhythm, he replied, "If Christ dined with fishermen, why would I feast like a king?" This was the new daily life inside the Vatican. The residence of the Pope was no longer cloaked in marble and gold, it echoed with simplicity. He opened his door to janitors, spoke with the Swiss guards during their shifts, and was known to help carry boxes when the archives needed moving. Pope Leo XIV's daily choices, his refusal of luxury cars, his use of public corridors instead of private ones, were not acts of theater. They were the embodiment of Catholic values: humility, service, and closeness to the people. In an institution often criticized for opulence, Leo XIV became a quiet revolution. And within the heart of the Catholic Church, something began to change. The air grew lighter. The walls seemed to listen. And behind them walked a pope who believed that real spiritual leadership was about presence, not power. High above St. Peter's Square, the Apostolic Palace gleamed in the Roman sun, a symbol of centuries of papal power. Yet behind its ornate windows, something peculiar remained. Silence. For the first time in living memory, the papal apartment, once the private sanctuary of the Supreme Pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church, stood empty by choice. Pope Leo XIV declined the grand residence. He requested instead to remain in the modest guest house of Casa Santa Marta, a two-room space once occupied by Pope Francis. No golden chandeliers. No private chef. Just a crucifix, a Bible, and a photograph of his parents. When a Vatican official nervously asked if he would reconsider, Pope Leo smiled and said, "Jesus was born in a stable, not a palace. My home should remind me of that every day." And so, the symbolic heart of the Vatican stood untouched, its walls echoing with absence. It became a monument to something rarer than relics: humility. Reporters from around the world speculated, was this a publicity move? A gesture of austerity? But within the Catholic Church, insiders whispered that something deeper was at work. This pope wasn't rejecting tradition, he was returning to its essence. He believed the spiritual leader of the Church should be closer to the people than to marble. Visitors who passed by his room described the scent of lavender oil, the presence of silence, and the quiet shuffle of papers as the Pope wrote long letters, often to prisoners, widows, or children. There was no throne in his room. Only a kneeling bench, well-worn and stained with devotion. And so, while the world watched for grand gestures, Pope Leo XIV made his boldest statement by doing nothing at all. By leaving a palace empty, he filled the Vatican with meaning. A reminder that true leadership in the Catholic faith is not measured in square footage, but in how closely one walks with Christ. In the Vatican, tradition is sacred. From the ceremonial robes of the Swiss Guard to the ancient Latin phrases spoken during Mass, each moment is a continuation of centuries of spiritual heritage. Yet something shifted quietly when Pope Leo XIV entered those hallowed halls. He began meeting with gardeners and kitchen staff during their breaks. not for formal announcements, but to ask their names, to hear about their families, and to bless their hands. Maria, a 60-year-old laundress, wept in silence after one such visit. She said, "No pope ever came to the laundry room. He walked in, smiled, and said, 'Thank you for helping me look presentable before God.' I thought my heart would stop." Pope Leo didn't just visit bishops and dignitaries. He walked among the least seen, the least heard. One day he joined the security staff during lunch, bringing with him a dish he had made himself, simple lentil stew. There was no announcement. No photographers. Just a shared meal and laughter echoing off stone walls. Tourists who passed through the Vatican museums were startled when a figure in simple white robes paused beside them, not a docent, but the Bishop of Rome himself. He would ask, "What brought you here? What are you searching for?" For many, the answer wasn't art. It was hope. And in that brief encounter, they found it. Pope Leo XIV transformed what it meant to be seen by the Pope. It wasn't about an audience, it was about presence. A moment of human connection with the spiritual leader of the Catholic world that left people in tears, not because of his title, but because of his tenderness. In the corridors of the Vatican, powerful cardinals now speak more softly. Staff linger longer in the chapel. Because when the Pope listens like that, when he loves like that, the entire church leans in. There's an old saying among those who serve at the Vatican, "You never know when you're standing on holy ground." Since the arrival of Pope Leo XIV, that saying became truer than ever. Because holy ground was no longer confined to chapels. It was found in parking lots, kitchens, and quiet hallways, where the Pope of the Catholic Church would pause, bow his head, and pray without warning. One rainy afternoon, a young custodian spotted him kneeling in the garden, hands pressed to the soil. No umbrella. No guards. Later, the Pope simply said, "The earth listens more deeply than people do." On another occasion, he slipped unnoticed into a hospital waiting room where a mother sat alone. Her son had been injured in an accident. No press followed, no guards interrupted. Just a man in white who held her hand, whispered a prayer, and left without introducing himself. She only discovered who he was days later. These moments weren't strategy. They were sacrament. To Pope Leo, every breath was a liturgy. Every heartbeat a hymn. He believed prayer wasn't an act of seclusion, but of inclusion. That silence was where God spoke loudest. And he modeled this not from the altar, but from the shadows. When Vatican officials asked if they should schedule more public prayers, he said, "God doesn't need an audience. He needs sincerity." That answer rippled through the Roman Curia, through monasteries, seminaries, and suburban parishes. And people began to pray again. Not to impress, but to connect. In the quiet corners of the most powerful religious center on earth, the Vicar of Christ walked like a monk, barefoot at times, unseen most of the time, but felt, always. Because wherever he paused, wherever he knelt, the church did too. On the morning of Pentecost 2025, millions tuned in expecting ceremony. Instead, they witnessed simplicity. No gold vestments. No trumpet fanfare. Just Pope Leo XIV standing at the window of Casa Santa Marta, the same place he chose to live, wearing a plain white cassock. Behind him, no ornate tapestries. Only a small cross. And then he spoke, not from a script, but from the soul. To every person watching, you are seen. You are loved. And you are not alone. The message wasn't long. But it echoed. Through parishes in the Philippines, through missions in Africa, through living rooms in South America where grandmothers clutched their rosaries and wept. The church is not marble, he said. The church is not robes. The church is the woman crying beside her child. The man who forgives before he is asked. The young heart that chooses peace over pride. Pope Leo XIV didn't issue new doctrine that day. He offered something rarer, presence. And a call to the church, not to rise in grandeur, but to bend in compassion. That morning, newspapers tried to interpret his words politically. But in homes across the world, something else happened. People knelt. They prayed. Not because they had to, but because they felt the stillness he carried. In that moment, the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church reminded humanity that when you have the whole world at your feet, the greatest power is not to command, but to kneel. If history remembers Pope Leo XIV for anything, let it not be his reforms, nor his speeches, nor even his global influence as the leader of the Catholic Church. Let it remember how he chose to live when given everything. A palace and he chose a room. A throne and he chose a bench. A crown and he chose the cross. Humility isn't weakness. It is the strongest force in a fractured world. Where pride divides, humility builds bridges. Where ambition devours, humility heals. And when Leo XIV stepped into power, he taught the Vatican and the world that leadership doesn't roar. It listens. He could have ruled with grandeur. Instead, he walked beside janitors, whispered comfort to strangers, and left the richest apartment in Rome empty. In doing so, he filled something far greater. The aching space in people's hearts that longed for a shepherd, not a sovereign. A father, not a ruler. A soul, not a symbol. So when the world writes its next chapter, when children ask what kind of man Pope Leo XIV was, let us answer with this: he had the Vatican at his feet. But he chose to walk barefoot beside us instead. And in that simple, sacred walk, he taught us the most important truth of all: that greatness lies not in how high you climb, but in how low you're willing to bow to love.